Visions for future interfaces. Note, biographical information for each panel can be found at futureofinterface.org/bios.
And today we have Bran, Ferren, and Jeri Ellsworth with us. And these are both incredible visionaries who are always building. So these are engineers. I'm sorry, these aren't sociologists. They aren't classic futurists. They're actually people that have built Disney rides and rockets. Yeah, when Jeri's startup was floundering a little bit, she just went off and started writing firmware for rockets. So we have people that really are grounded, in the future, can fly. Let me just start off by saying, we've got input sensors and ergonomics, and we got perception and interpretation and modeling, and output, and then feedback somewhere fits in the middle of it. But one day, about 3 months ago, I was sitting with my neighbors, and an 87-year-old guy walks in and says, I was playing with ChatGPT the other day, and I asked it to express my profession of being an anesthesiologist in the language of Shakespeare, in iambic pentameter. And it did a fabulous, let me read this poem to you. So there's something incredible about input that this broadcast medium of language has touched him. And so I guess I want to ask both of you to begin with. My first thing is, in input and output devices, this is a strange input device that an 87-year-old could quickly bring up and imagine a new way of asking a question. What do you guys think of the future of input devices and output devices?
I have some opinions on that. Coming from the video game space, coming from working on consumer products, where sometimes the best thing about products is not having something part of it. And so what excites me about AI and being able to express yourself to these deep learning models is that there's potential that we can eliminate a lot of our interface, right? Which makes it more accessible to folks that are maybe, I think when we're preparing for this presentation, someone called it crystallizing of their, how they interact with things, and they're a little bit more rigid. And so you can map these interactions to, potentially what they're more familiar with, and eliminate some of the more complicated input schemes that we might be tempted to chase after.
Let me just add, I think there are really only 3 types of interface design: past, present, and future. There are intuitive ones where it's self-obvious, such as a door and you push it and it opens, or musical instruments, a kazoo. You can get about as good on a kazoo in 5 minutes as anyone has ever been on a kazoo. And those sort of intuitive interfaces are, a hammer, a glass of water. The use of this after you are about 2 years old is pretty intuitive, that you understand gravity, etc. There are the non-intuitive, imagined, abstract interfaces. Helicopter flight controls. There's absolutely nothing intuitive about flying a helicopter. And if you don't believe me, go take an initial lesson and you'll see what I mean. Most CAD and scientific software, there's no way you can intuit your way through it if you haven't used those types of programs before and understand the concept behind it. A stenograph machine, there's, again, you look at what a stenographer uses, and it's not in any way obvious of how you would get to being able to do that. And, if we stayed with musical instruments, a violin, or, a cello, where if you have a child taking lessons with those, it will be many years before something remotely resembling music emanates from your child and that system. They're complicated learned interfaces. The third type, which is unfortunately the most common, is bad interface design. And I think all interface design is some combination of those 3. on the example you used about ChatGPT inspiring an 80-year-old, and I don't mean this to demean it, but
87.
Sorry, exactly. In the case I do mean to demean it, the value of parlor tricks, the value to do something that a person never imagined a machine, a person could do. If you have a very dour, serious person, and they start a conversation with a hilarious joke, that's a parlor trick. It gets your attention, it resets the frame of reference, etc. And if we go back to the earliest conversations with machines, Eliza, etc., what you can do is when it gets stuck, say something outrageous or turn it into a question or do some combination of other things, which is not expected by the other side, the participant in the conversation. So I think that, again, it's important to understand that when we say an AI like ... did a fantastic job of something else, a high percentage of that is based on a series of things that has nothing to do with the idea that it is sentient or intelligent or in any way a mirror of your process of how you think and how you do things, or for that matter, what impresses you.
You touched on two things that I really like about this. So I love that you brought up one interface doesn't do everything for everybody. There's got to be multiple interfaces to most of the problems in our world. That's important to remember. Sometimes, when we are making interfaces, we try to make it generic, and sometimes we don't even service, anybody by trying to make it serve everybody. The other thing that you touched on, the parlor trick, that just brings me back to a lot of great mentors I work with that talk about changing user behavior. And there's got to be an incentive to change people's behavior if there's something new, new interfaces that they need to work with. And sometimes it's a parlor trick. It's something to keep them engaged long enough to learn the motions. Microsoft and Solitaire and Minesweeper was a great example of just getting people clicking a mouse, right?
Well,
Very
and so
simple.
much of game design is about that, is how do you keep them hooked, or, Easter eggs or other things to just remain engaged. But I think it's also important to note that through all good intentions, Microsoft adopting the KVM interface set interface design back 30 years. So we stayed stagnant in this modality. And, Alan Kay is an old dear friend, and he never imagined that overlapping Windows interfaces would be this thing that we still have with us, or the concept of folders, or the concept of the rest of it. So the problem is things can become ubiquitous in a way that actually damages forward progress, because it's just like, speaking of other mentors, when, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert decided to write a book that said that neural nets can't work, that when the best people in the field are saying it can't work, a whole bunch of PhD students don't study it. Cold fusion, a whole bunch of other things, sometimes with good reason. But in areas like this, the part that I think so many people miss is that, and let's not say good interface design, great interface design is equal parts art and design as it is science and engineering. And the idea that you simply take an algorithmic approach to how you design an interface is responsible for so many of that third class I mentioned of bad interfaces.
Sure. So if we take a look at your Eliza example for a moment, what works with it? What are the things that works with it? Is it provokes us as Socrates, a Socratic method might, but also it is in the social domain, which we always appreciate. And in doing so, it was very compelling. Where Perry, something that was another modeling, psychological modeling interactive of the time of 1967, by the way, was not compelling to people. And so when we're going forward and we start thinking about this, we found that ChatGPT, last week there was a paper written that it actually helped people prepare for their boards. They actually were better at their boards. This is terrifying to believe. I mean, how could that be when it's lying, when it doesn't actually get the correct answers? And it's because is part of that Socratic method as well as other issues probably. So the question is, what interface brings us to fidelity and competence? And what is it that gives us mastery, where we actually absorb and own the what we've learned, and we become virtuosos in what we do. So that's kind of the next thing I want you guys to speak to.
Well, from my perspective, I think we have to be very clear that when we talk about interface design, it's not just the physical thing you touch or the thing you see, but it's the interaction with those. And the huge missing components that have to be in the next generations, from my perspective, are a combination of common sense and, for lack of a better word, multisensory or extreme multisensory, where it addresses the fact that human beings do a whole bunch of things simultaneously, and rather than it confusing and overloading the system, it makes it easier for us. We were born to fuse. It's very hard often to hear people wearing masks because you can't read their lips, which is just as important as people think it's muffling the sounds coming from their mouth. And yes, there is some high frequency attenuation, but most of it is people don't realize they're lip reading as part of the process. So if I'm in a car using my GPS navigator system, GNSS navigator, and I am in desperate need of a cheeseburger, I don't want it to suggest the closest place, which is 15 miles behind my 500-mile drive. I would like it to suggest one that's 22 miles ahead in the direction I'm going, because it understands that driving back out of my way 20 minutes, even though it's closer, doesn't allow me to accomplish our goal. So the idea that the systems understand the goals, have an intuition about it based upon some emulation of human common sense, and the idea that we shouldn't have to decide it's a speech interface or it's a touch interface or it's a breath interface or it's a brain interface. We should, just as we do with people, use the best communication path at that moment. And so if I'm, for example, in a foreign country and I speak their language poorly, which in my case is most of the United States, as well as the rest of the world, you resort to hand gesture, as I'm doing now. You resort to expression. Some research has said that in a video teleconference, typically 70 to 80% of the information that is critical in a real meeting is lost, which has to do with intonation of voice, which has to do with expression on the face, the fact that you can't scan the room and see how people are addressing you. And there are a whole variety of these things that can be fixed. But that would be my sense, is where the future needs to be to make the next dramatic step forward to where we're stuck now.
You touch on some good topics there, and I think that we're on an inflection point right now with sensor fusion, where that's becoming possible. Sensors distributed through our world are going to pick up on our emotional state, our intentions, and smart models are going to be able to predict, what our intentions are going to be. Your case of, driving the correct direction to pick up a cheeseburger is going to be more apparent to these computer models. And that's only possible because of the distributed computing that we can put throughout our world. Challenge is, how do you connect all of these things, in an efficient way, when everyone wants to silo all of their individual devices. Microsoft wants to have Windows isolated from Mac, and your Ring doorbell is isolated from, everything else. And so that's going to be a challenge going forward, so we can actually utilize all these sensors out there.
And when you do get them all together, how do you not make it creepy and Big Brother-ish?
Yeah.
Oh, it's already there. It's already creepy as hell. So
maybe we can teach
creepy is of course an interpretation, and we it has to do with our perspective, and we have to remember. Or I'm thinking about how basically, the reason we're stuck with this old WIMP interface and stuff is partly a cultural artifact. And that is that, we sometimes do better with interfaces that we know than ones that could be better. And so that's an issue. But the thing is, we're building different we have so many new technologies. We can make curtain walls, we can eliminate the windows and just have the window there when it needs to be. We can, throw glasses on our face and subvert the entire visual interface, or we can be wearing wearables versus the environment having all these sensors. And I guess the question, I'm trying to ask here is, we have this chance to think about the whether these things are peripheral and distracting, and whether our focus becomes dissipated as we are making these interfaces, and what's going to help with that. With is the input devices going to help? Is the conference? How are we going to figure out whether we want the things to be in us, on us, sewn into our skin, or in the environment we can reach out to touch? Are either of them less or more creepy than each other?
Well, I think one thing that if we look back a little bit can lead us to what we need to do in the future. You look at older technology that got adopted, it's pretty much giving us superpowers, right? So anything that gives us superpowers, I mean, there's a lot of things you can imagine, like, AR glasses that can let you, have X-ray vision through a wall. And what's the advantage of that? Or heat vision, or biometrics on some kind of wearable that's measuring your frustration state while you're trying to interface with the computer. Some are more subtle and more present, giving you superpowers, and that's how you can drive adoption.
I think there's another component, which again, I just watched, which is, say, Ted, you just went from over down here when someone else came on to up over here. And considering
breaking the metaphor completely, a spatial metaphor.
And we spatially orient ourselves. So once we train ourselves, we know to look somewhere. So obviously the person designing this thought there was some priority above that, or wasn't even aware of that way that humans tend to operate. I think the issue is, what caught my attention in your question is when we start talking about the future as if it's VR goggles and other stuff, glasses. I hate glasses. There's a huge industry called contact lenses, which exists so that people like me don't have to do what you're doing, Ted and Greg, which is wear glasses, because I hate glasses. And the bigger you make the glasses, or the narrower field of view you make the glasses, or the other things that you do in order to accommodate an AR system or some combination, other than the fact that you out in public look ridiculous, which some people actually care about, many don't, but the idea that you've got these things with a diesel engine on the back of it, and your fused sensor array on the top, and millimeter.
Well, let me challenge you on that, though. I mean, cell phones are kind of ridiculous. Like, if we just etch a sketch, our brain, and forget about it, and we just show up with a cell phone, we're talking into this thing, it seems a little ridiculous. I mean, a lot of technology is hard to get our heads wrapped around, that we would actually be carrying like a brick phone around with us, or, wearing a crazy thing with antennas sticking out of it so it could sense our world. But, when there's enough value and it makes our life more efficient, there's going to be more adoption to it. So we might be surprised, like sticking electrodes in our brain. It may show up before we even imagine.
That's better. Probably swallowing a pill is better, it'll wire you, and then if you don't pay your Verizon bill, it'll be excreted in your urine. But from a practical point of view, let me take issue with your taking issue, because I actually kind of like the form factor of a phone. I have these things called fingers. Mm-hmm. They're designed for grasping, and a well-designed phone interface and other things like that I actually find very convenient. And when people say, well, wouldn't you rather use voice? And the answer is, well, if I'm in a movie theater, using voice is probably not appreciated by the people around me, et cetera. So I think that the art of interface design is these things will continue to evolve. And again, implants always have seemed obvious to me. My problem is I always think they're 25 years off, and I've been thinking that for about 40 years now. So things take longer than you might think. But I think that the idea of choice and selection, if we take the art model, I would like a choice of what art I put in my house. I don't want the art that everyone else has in their house, perhaps. And it's the same with interface design. I ought to be able to take something that works well, is aesthetically pleasing, that makes me happy. It might be a fashion statement. Again, perhaps it is glasses because you want this particular style or some other combination. So my sense is that the future is not in any way in one specific area, but it's going to be adding diversity. And incidentally, Greg, to your earlier point, that kind of diversity is what leads, I think, to insights and breakthroughs in how people who are challenged, whether it's visually or acoustically or mechanically or some other form, are accommodated. The good news about, as we get much more powerful computing architectures, clouds, et cetera, as we get common sense introduced through AI, ML, whatever combination, the ability to do not just custom interfaces or specialized interfaces, but interfaces that self-customize for each individual's aesthetic, personal, as well as mechanical, for lack of another word, preferences. That, to me, is the exciting new frontier.
Sure. So I'm not sure, Bran, that you don't have an implant. You may have had some corneal
I have a mechanical hip, so I actually do, but it doesn't very much.
And a lot of my friends actually, might have, there's patents out there for putting displays in the lenses, and people are wearing, there's tens of millions of people walking around with hearing aids that are in their ears, and of course, getting a little bit of insulin here or there. I want to go back to challenging the challenging of the challenging you guys were making, which is this thing is supposedly ergonomic. I always think that the cell phone is basically a come pickpocket me tool, because I've got both my hands consumed just to be able to do anything. And I have neither of my hands, which are the things I care about most, as you were talking about, Bran. And one time I was actually on a rock climbing situation, and I was lead climbing. That means that the rope is not attached to anything but below me. And I got this very important call from Mitch Resnick, actually. And instead of not taking it, I said, "Oh, I'll just say I can't talk." Of course, he started talking, right? So I was up in an extremely dangerous place, and that interface just wasn't working. So when we're going, through these processes of deciding whether something is going to be a useful interface or not, the question is whether the self-esteem that we have to believe that we can take the call, which was, I was wrong, I was stupid, I didn't die of it, luckily, is really appropriate. Do we actually have interfaces that are socially appropriate, that can actually understand when they are doing something that is completely naughty, like ringing me while I'm climbing? Or do we have to have new kinds of interfaces? As you guys know, I've edited a book on peripheral interaction. Most of it, the things that we pay attention to the world, are not they're not a spreadsheet in front of us in a cubicle with the door closed behind us. We are now in a situation where we are always walking around with
I would say cell phones are absolutely deadly. You just think about the number of people that have killed themselves in cars with it. There's got to be a better way, right? Or appropriate way, depending contextually on what you're doing.
I would have liked your story better, Ted, if Mitch told you to hang on in that situation. But nonetheless, I think but from my perspective, there is this thing called dumbass human behavior. It's a technical term, which is what you experienced, as is texting when driving, as is when a whole combination of things. And if you look at death rate driving automobiles, it went down for years, now it's going up. Guess why? But you can't fix that, because human dumbass behavior will counter any measures you make in order to do it. Witness how many people have done things to their Tesla to violate any safety system that occasionally gets put into a Tesla to prevent you from driving without your hands on the wheel or this, that, or the other thing. And if you've ever driven cars with lane keeping, some of them use capacitive proximity to see if your hand's there. So you're always testing what's the minimum amount of contact I need to make this thing remotely useful rather than something I fight. Or is it one that looks for reflected force, so you just wiggle it every so often? We do workarounds because we're clever and we're like that to defeat the best plans to keep us safe and keep us alive. And at a certain point, you say, I will implement draconian measures that prevent you from doing it. Trivial to make your cell phone not work when you're on a mountain, not work when you're driving a car, not work when you're flying a jet, and any number of things like that. And if you do that, people won't buy it and will buy the one that doesn't implement that or will buy the workaround. So I think we have to incorporate that in our interface design thinking.
Yeah, it brings me back to, it's almost always a golden rule to eliminate, functions to your interfaces, if possible, if you can maintain the same efficiency. If there was some magical dust we could sprinkle in our car to do phone calls and not touch anything, it'd probably be a better interface, assuming you can get people to adopt it.
Well, and when programming my first Digital Equipment Corp, remember them computer, when you were about to do something catastrophic, it said, "Are you sure?" And you developed an instantaneous reflex. Whenever you saw "Are you sure?" your hand seeked and punched Y, thereby countermeasuring the whole reason that was put in there. And so, again, I think it's so often easy in interface design to forget about human behavior and their needs to do things that are dumb and self-destructive because they think there is a higher goal they are accomplishing, or an easier goal, or a more seductive goal, or whatever else. And that will be forever a challenge in interface design, as it has been since the first machine was developed.
Sure. And I mean, this really brings us to when do we delegate and when do we want control? So, I made a smart car where it gave affirmations to be successful. And when it made criticisms, people actually drove worse. But, we're busy taking away our agency with today's cars for the purpose of, drinking a soda. But actually, there'd be something fantastic with the self-driving cars if they just pack the cars tightly and let us have 3-5 times more people on a freeway with in a safer way, which of course they do, but nobody talks about. And so I think one of the questions there is this delegation versus control, and what do we do to guide the direction of user interface so that it takes us towards things that will make us more competent, more happy, more satisfied with the actions it is doing.
My mind goes towards things that I've seen in the video game industry. I've worked in this space for quite a while. If we can make more intimate connection, more personal connection to your interface, for instance, in games, many times you're onboarded and you go through the learning of your interface, the using of your interface through non-player characters that guide you through, and you develop an emotional connection. You tend to behave one way or another, less aggressively towards particular characters or not. Begs the question, what if my car was my best friend and I didn't want to crash it, and there was like that real emotional connection to the car? Can that be part of the interface? You talked about having affirmations in your car, but definitely, we've seen it in the video game space. You can affect people's behavior. For instance, the Valve game Portal, when I was working there, it surprised us. There was a thing called a companion cube. It does nothing in the game, but you have to carry it around with you. People got connected to it. And then there was a point in the game where you had to drop it down a pit and destroy it. People stopped playing the game because they didn't want to destroy this companion cube that did nothing, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I also think we have to, as interface designers, think specially about things that are life safety related, because unlike most games, not all games, but most games, how you control the autonomy of a car or the semi-autonomy of a car, where you are teaming with a car, and the idea of, person-machine teaming, whether it's for the Air Force, for aircraft, et cetera, is a hot topic at the moment in AI. But for example, understanding the safe operating envelope of the human who owns you is an important thing for an interface. So, and by the way, life safety is the person who crosses the street in the city you're in, staring at their phone and gets run over by a car. And the question is, how does the phone and the car collaborate to prevent that from happening? So on one level, the car can see the person with the phone in the way and stop irrespective of what the driver does, assuming that there's a speed and closure and braking distance which is able to accommodate it. Understanding the safe operating envelope of the driver would create a following distance where that is always the case, so that in the vast majority of times, if someone crossing a street gets out in the way and my driver isn't stopping, I'm going to stop. And, that's car participation. Phone participation may be saying duck and, this, or jump back, or give you an electric shock as you're crossing, or some combination of other things. So I think the notion that we're missing is it's not just about human machine collaboration, but machine to machine collaboration to save humans. And that is entirely feasible for some significant number of things that people get hurt with now, or, can do. And the flip side of this is not what people can do to hurt themselves, but what they can do to hurt others. And so, your example of holding your phone in your hand is an invitation to pickpocket you. Well, in the future, all you're going to have is your phone, so that there's nothing to pickpocket, because all those obsolete things like caches and wallets will be gone. But I think that the bigger issue on all of this is right now, we have to think too hard about what device does which and when and how and under what circumstances. And the ability to seamlessly have, for lack of a better term, I like the term, a constellation of devices that are aware of each other, that talk to each other, that can hand off responsibilities to each other as appropriate, with this notion of a safe operating envelope, so that it won't do something that puts you in greater jeopardy and risk above a certain threshold that either a company or society or you, or in the case of someone like my daughter, the parents decide will be not acceptable behavior for your child until they're an adult.
Well, we're supposed to be looking way out in the future. Why do we even carry around devices anymore? If we're just going to look out 100 years, why doesn't every surface become our interface, right?
Well, I absolutely agree. But the counter to that is, because we like devices and we like objects, and people like wearing watches that they find attractive, or, why are watches with mechanical complications as popular and expensive now as they've ever been? It's because people like things that are archaic, or things that are beautiful, or things that are that. So I think there's going to be a balance that, and this I think is an important point, one has to appreciate the difference between need and desire. And in most cases, desire wins. So if you take a typical young American male looking for their first car, they're just getting out of MIT, they're broke, they're getting ready to start a family, you have a whole series of things in mind. They're looking at electric or hybrid sport utility vehicles, bigger, a family van. They do all of that. That guy, if left to his own devices, will go out and buy a used Porsche, which meets none of the criteria that was agreed to for the sensible first car for a family, but it's because desire wins. And so
But that
many
changes over time, though. Who's
sure, it evolves,
hooking up horses to a wagon because they love the old school wagon mode of transport, so
Right, but
if we get far
when
enough
there
out,
were- yeah, exactly. But we still
devices
have
may
horses.
look so archaic as a horse-drawn
So-
wagon.
Well, I
So this idea
understand.
of ownership, we have this idea of, like we wish we were marsupials, we could carry everything with us. Of course, that's a little complicated. So we got this idea of this constellation of things and this operating envelope. And I guess the question, becomes sometimes when we are this car and this pedestrian, let's call it, when is it the two of them working together is better, and when do they fight each other? And I think that we get in terms of good user interface design, of course, the phase has to be aligned for things to be helpful, and for us to get into this flow where there's a level of competency and ability and an understanding of a direction. And what do we do about getting to this flow, especially because, as Bran says, there's always more than one actor, or we don't call it interaction, and we have to somehow align ourselves, or we don't have communication or any interaction that works at all.
Was there a question in that?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, when is it better to do things together, and when is it better to do things alone, for example? And what gets people into the flow? I mean, we are interacting now with smart systems all the time, and they can either break our concentration or help us with our concentration, whether relative to some goal or direction that we're trying to.
But we're
Yeah, some might
interfacing.
argue that we're getting pulled into solo experiences with our devices. What's the world look like if it's more of a group collaboration around devices or around interfaces? Probably it'd be mentally more healthy for us. It's just a speculation.
I agree. I think that it's important, though, that we realize we're using smart devices with a very small s. There is no smart in them. They're just ones that are designed to be less dumb. So from my perspective, I think that flexibility is the key word, is that you ought to be able to decide how you wish to use each device. And you may have a completely novel use for that device that the designers never thought of, but the architecture and the implementation ought to be able to support that. I mean, the worst thing is I bought a car years ago, which, as cell phones were becoming more popular, a luxury car that had a great place to take a certain Nokia model phone and plug it in with the connector, and it was nicely form fitted to accept that Nokia phone, which of course wasn't available at the time I bought the car, let alone there. So I spent the rest of my life looking at this little armrest compartment with this thing and a wire coming out of it.
You should have leased so you could get the later model as soon as
Exactly.
it came out.
But I think the key is flexibility, so that even though the designer contemplated you using it with method A, you end up using method R, which they never contemplated, but it's capable of accepting it, learning it, etc. And then when you go to new devices, you can emulate your bizarre interface strategy because you've grown accustomed to it, are fond of it, and have a relationship with it.
Right. So as we are trying to build a relationship with things, we've been talking about smart city and smart house and smart transportation, and smart medicine for decades now. And I think that this word smart that is really how do we make it fail soft also, and how do we make it adaptive, as Bran was talking about? Can you guys speak as much as possible? Think about a concrete scenario that you think of in these all these smart isms that we're talking about, and where this flexibility and adaptability will take us.
It's always an interesting design challenge, right? When you're making an interface or any device, is there's always edge cases where it fails, and challenge for the end user is when it fails that they understand why it fails. And so you always have to think about, what's the interaction look like when it does fail, and that the user can recover. Yeah, exactly. That was a good point you brought up. And that's really challenging. You start making, to challenge your point is, if things are ultimately flexible in every dimension, it's very hard to have consistency for the end user and onboard them to it and keep it consistent and have these failure modes that make sense. And so.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. And I think that case in point, if you rent a car and get into it, you would like to think that turning the steering wheel to the left results in the car going in the direction of left. But, that's all part of that whole bad design thing about doing things which lead people to the wrong direction because you've given them flexibility in places where it will get them in trouble. That gets back to either the safe operating envelope or just simply good design practice. I think to answer your question, Ted, we have not been dealing with smart devices all around us. We've been dealing with things that marketing and branding people call smart devices that are in that category of either on the extreme, awful, dumbass devices, or on the other end, gee, it's better than nothing, but it sure has a long ways to go. So I think we have to dispel ourselves of the notion that we have been accustomed to working with smart devices because this is branding, not reality. And whether we're talking about a smart city or we're talking about, you name it, we have a long ways to go to achieve that. So I think from my perspective, put the marketing behind us and start working towards how would we as interface devices actually start defining what smart is, and perhaps, and truth in advertising, before you can call it smart at a certain point, it actually have to meet some basic set of criteria, including perhaps looking after your welfare or that of your family.
Sure.
Smart devices 10 years from now are going to look pretty darn smart to us. And 100 years from now, they're going to look absolutely like sticks and stones. So I think we're always going to be faced with, marketing smart devices, and they're going to be pretty smart for the time being and just not be smart decades down the road. Just as things evolve.
And has been observed in the past, the question 100 years in the future is not going to be how much you like your device, but whether your device likes you.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that the provoking thing about branding and marketing being the devil is an interesting question, because without understanding or believing that something will work, it doesn't work also. And so marketing and sales go together, but it's much more interesting that when marketing becomes the learning and the teaching, and the question is, we have to believe that something is going to work for it to work at all, and we have to care about it to learn how to use it at all. So what is going to be, Greg had brought up this idea that people were not digitally competent at some level in their life because they get intimidated. Is it that they really have lost their ability to learn, or is it that they don't believe that it's valuable, or they are able to learn something? How do we get the self-esteem to believe that we can learn something, or that something is valuable?
Well, I think it's one of two things. Either you're giving them enough of a reward so that it's worth the energy input for them to try to learn something, or we design interfaces where they don't have to learn something, where it can just emulate the behaviors the older devices or methodologies that they were accustomed to do. People get old, people get tired, people don't want to invest the energy in learning something new when the existing thing works just fine for them. So I think that I don't think it's a black and white issue. I think it's a question of what are we trying to do to accommodate this group of people, which you could also consider special needs people, right? A special need person could be someone who just doesn't want to change interface, or is unable to change interface because they're at the stage in their lives where they don't have the cognitive ability to learn something new, practice it, try it, and remember it. So I think all of those things are a valid set of special use cases that in some ways will be clusterable as a group, so you don't have to design it for the individual. Other times you will have to optimize it, or a professional might have to optimize it for you after observing what problems you're having with it and make appropriate modifications or mode selections or whatever.
Yeah, as you're designing interfaces, it seems that, incremental interfaces tend to win out. Is there a trajectory we can set today that will get us somewhere where we want to be, decades down the road, so that we don't have this huge shift in interactions for, folks like you described that may be a little more hardened in their, the way they want to interact.
Right. So I think that this question of an evolutionary direction versus a inventive direction is really at the core of one of my last questions as we, well, who knows, we have a few more minutes as we go forward. And really, I think it's a really important question: is how do we, we believe we can invent, but there's a lot of value in trying things out. And really the question is, validating. How do we evaluate things that we invent? Because that valuation metric, in some sense, is where the whole idea of evolution comes from. So as we go forward, how important is evaluation, validation, invention, evolution? These really are the tools that we use to create the interfaces that we're going to be creating.
I think the single biggest issue that we face when examining this, and it's tied to this notion of innovation. How do you innovate? How do you come up with something new? How do you do this? And I say innovate rather than invent, just to address the incremental. Sometimes it's a change of something existing. I think the single biggest enemy to innovation is consensus. And I think this notion that teams have to agree on something and a focus group has to like it, et cetera, guarantees mediocrity and, poor incremental change. Design as an artist, again, you work on a movie. It's clear what the role of the director is. And that director can either choose to have a faithful interpretation of the script or do something different. They can cast Goldilocks as a little girl with golden hair, or as a 400-pound sumo wrestler and cast against type. Up to them to figure out if they can pay that off. I think it's the same with interface design. I think point of view, thoughtful design with an individual leading it and making the final decisions with a team of people who work with them and collaborate, that they are the editor and they pick and choose which ideas to accept or not. But the flip side of this, and the movie analogy is a good one, is you have to know your audience. And that doesn't mean know what they're going to instantly be comfortable with. No one thought that the solution for the next generation of a BlackBerry was to take away all the buttons, make sure there's a music player in it, put a store to buy apps when nobody's ever heard of an app, and make sure the battery dies about halfway through your day, and that the battery's not interchangeable. That wouldn't have been something that the focus group working on the next generation of BlackBerry came up with, but it changed the world in a meaningful and important way, so that any company that wasn't chasing that model became effectively obsolete in the marketplace. So my view is you need passion, you need thoughtfulness, you need strong points of view. You need to understand your audience. And in the film business, that can mean test audiences and seeing how they react, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that you're going to make everybody happy all of the time is just nonsense. And the emotional part of it, and what makes a hit versus not makes a hit, is about, did you do something unique that people find valuable? And not everybody is going to love it or love you. If you drive yourself down to a consensus model, including the users as part of that, my view is you guarantee mediocrity and never doing anything significant.
You bring up some really interesting points. I think we've all experienced this in our careers, where we've design something more efficient, more effective, better in some way in our minds, and without a forcing function to ramrod it into the market, it's doomed. And we've also probably all worked on projects where it was designed by committee and it was mediocre across the board and extremely frustrating. You couldn't optimize it one way or another. And so, the old story of like the customer doesn't know what they really want, comes to mind. You hear that a lot from product designers, and it's true in a lot of ways. But of course, if we had your interface where you could customize it in any way, then it'd all be solved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this iPhone, I actually imagine that what was special about it, it didn't have as good a camera or as good a radio or as good a battery as the Nokia N95, for example, which also had a better antenna and had an AF radio. But what it had is the ability to show your children to your colleagues immediately with almost no interaction. It was one click to take a picture and then be able to show it to people. And so there was something prescient in this point of view without a reason is just arrogance. And one thing that I don't like in the point of view designers are the kings approach is when people don't have the quiver of understanding of what works and what doesn't work for people. So we had, as user interface designers, we had Fitts law. It says, if something's small, it's hard to find, and something's close, it's easier to get to. Okay, and now then we move to even better tools for evaluating these metrics, and steering law and modeling, and we know a lot about perception and cognitive abilities. You can't remember a lot. You can't change things you can't change what you're thinking about very fast. So where does science interact with this designer point of view? And what are we going to be developing better and better tools, or are we going to spend a lot of our time developing guys that strut around and say, I know the best thing for my users?
Well, I think the biggest innovation in the last couple decades is, telemetry on all of our devices. We have visibility, to an extreme level on how our users are actually using our device. So, the days of focus groups and trying to guess and, all the biases with that are gone. You can actually launch products and understand how it's being used. Video game space does that all the time. They make people play the game and they track their eyes and they look at, how the user interface is working out. They move things around and they can be very methodical about it. And then once the game deploys, they can watch, every single bullet that's shot within a game and see if there's like clusters of bullets going in a certain area, and that's an exploit within that particular product. Same thing on physical devices. You can get that same telemetry back, and it's only going to get better going forward as, again, coming back to sensor fusion, there's going to be a time where, maybe you do have a cell phone, maybe it doesn't have appropriate sensors to grab this telemetry to analyze, but there's going to be 1,000 other sensors in your world that are going to be looking at your iPhone 52 and, feeding that back to, the mother company to make improvements on the next device.
Well, and I think the relationship between design and science is fairly basic. If you're an artist, science gives you phthalo blue and, these pigments and canvas and a whole bunch of other things. If you're building buildings, science gives you steel or welding or rivets or structural engineering, and art and design is what you do with it in the form of an architect. And it's not just give and take, because very often the designer will wish to accomplish something that there is no material or is no science that accomplishes, in which case the science has to catch up with that vision. And, that is certainly going to be the case in the future of interface design. There are a whole bunch of things you wish to do. Now that we have LiDARs built into phones and tracking and visual tracking and enough horsepower to do facial recognition, et cetera, it's opened up a whole new set of possibilities that you didn't have 20 years ago. But much of that was driven because people said, I think I want to unlock my phone by just looking at it. So what science do we need to develop to do that robustly and do it in the dark and do it in the light and do it in the rest of it to be able to be there? So I think there is always a tension between the two. The best designers are always wanting things that don't exist yet and pushing the science and engineering forward. The designers want a phone that you look at and is seamless and doesn't have fasteners. Well, it turns out that's a lot harder to engineer and not have screws holding the case together and the rest of it. That's a purely aesthetic choice, right? And it's one which is done for a variety of reasons, but you don't get to pick one or the other. At its best, they're both working together. And that's the case for architects and scientists and engineers and device and game designers, et cetera.
So Bran, I just love the point. I mean, it's incredible that these phones no longer actually fit our hands, and they don't have a tether, so we can drop a $1,200 device down a drain in a street. But
it's good business.
What?
Good business practice.
That's right. But I think that the idea I want to take from your tension is interplay. I think if there's being an interplay between the possible and the envisioned. For example, the accelerometers in these phones are just incredibly good. They are better than anything that rockets had in them 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I did something where we were able to measure somebody's tremor when they just woke up, and within 95% accuracy, we could use the phone to tell whether they'd slept well in the last 2 weeks, as well as any other method we could come up with. So this was not envisioned by the people that put the accelerometer in there, but that affordance gave us a direction. I know we're running a little bit close to the edge, so I want to take a question I see that's been asked. Dan Gruen has asked how much we believe that the inner workings have to be exposed for people to understand or to be able to have facility with their interface. Do we have to understand it, or do we just have to accept it? So I think that this question of whether these AIs are going to be explainable goes into that. Some of that, maybe you want to speak to it a little bit.
Well, I think that, sorry.
I was just going to say it's a great question. From experience, most people don't care about the inner workings. Of course, folks that are in this seminar probably are deeply interested in the inner workings for various reasons, ethical reasons, efficiency reasons. And I personally believe that there needs to be some understanding for the power users, for the people optimizing the systems, but for the average user, the more you can make that fade away in the background, I think the better.
Yeah, I guess I would add that from my perspective, almost everything in our world exceeded the complexity threshold that any given human is capable of deeply understanding a long time ago. Nobody knows how their computer works or their cell phone works at all levels. You don't understand how the operating system is working. You don't understand the RF. You don't understand a whole bunch of other things. You may understand aspects of it. And for a casual user, it's not. But I would actually take an opposite position that I think it's important in some levels for them not to understand it. Now, there are consequences to that, but there's this thing called magic, which delights people and amuses them and entertains them. And if you know how the magic is done, it takes away the magic. And so from an interface perspective, which is all about interacting with the human experience, the ability to delight, amuse, and entertain people in a surprising way that they didn't anticipate because they don't understand it is equally as important as having an understanding of things that can get you in trouble, or when it might be right or when it might be wrong, so you don't make critical decisions about investing your entire future in Bitcoin 20 minutes before it collapses.
So I think that this magical direction is important. And of course, as things fade away, or become more that we still want them to be apprehendable and, of course, accessible. And with that, I think it's time for Greg to retake control of this magical opportunity that we've had to share with Bran and Jeri these fantastic thoughts about the future of interface.